In this screencast, we'll discuss the impacts of urbanization. So here's the thing. At this point, about 55% of the world's population lives in cities. And it's projected that by 2050, that number will climb to 68 to 70%. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. For instance, here in Korea, about 50% of the population lives in just the Seoul metropolitan area. So collectively, if you look at cities like Busan and Daegu and Seoul, a significant amount of the population of South Korea lives in urban environments. And the good news is, urban areas can be planned, and they can be lead to efficiencies that can allow for a better protection of the environment. But they do come with a host of impacts that need to be mitigated. So here you go. So what is urbanization? Basically, it's the conversion of wild land and agricultural land into living spaces, shopping areas, houses, roadways, businesses. So it's essentially, you're putting down concrete and buildings where you used to have open land with trees and farms and things like that. That's what we mean by urbanization. Now, it's really unavoidable for urbanization to be stopped. It's something that we just need to accept and embrace and plan for. And if we do so, it can actually be a good way of helping the environment deal with this burgeoning human population. Now, again, we need to keep the human population in check, and but people more and more tend to move away from rural lands and into cities, and so that brings with it certain consequences that need to be understood so that their impacts can be mitigated. So let's just think about a city. What does it take to run a city? For a city to function. And the first thing in urban planning is just think about what is it you need. Okay, so first of all, you need transportation. You need a network of roads and railways, and I suppose also canals and rivers, but usually it's roads and railways, in order to bring goods and people into the city, so that the people who live in the city can get food, people who don't live in the city can get in there to work. Now, what else do you need? Well, people, as they go through their day, think about your day. As you consume products, whether it be food or things that you purchase, there's packaging, there's leftover stuff, there's things that you just have to get rid of. There's waste products. So you need to do something with the waste that people generate. You have to plan for what to do with their waste. It has to go somewhere, and something needs to be done with it. People need water. They need it to drink. They need it to bathe. They need to clean their clothes. They need to flush their toilets. So you've got a plan for a city. How are you going to get? Where are you going to get the clean water from? And how are you going to distribute to all the people who need it? Uh, and similarly, people, when they eat, their digestive systems are going to produce waste products, and we use hopefully a water system for flushing it out of people's homes. So we had to collect all this sewage, and we have to have a way of um, reducing the impact of the sewage on the environment. We're quite good at doing this normally, but you have to have that plan in place. People also need to have electrical power. Our culture runs on electricity, so you need to be able to generate electricity and transmit it into the city for usage. And you also have to plan for the fact that in cities you have a lot of impervious surface where infiltration is not possible. So there's going to be a lot of runoff in a city. You have to give some thought to what you're going to do with that runoff to avoid a host of problems that come with having too much water flowing into rivers during a storm event. Let's start with transportation. Okay, so roadways. They, they unfortunately they usually aren't planned. They usually are things that evolve over time. They start small, the city gets bigger, you add another lane, it gets a little bigger, you add a parallel highway, then you got to have an interchange, and before long you have situations like the one you see here, right? Now, one thing that's unfortunate is that a lot of people don't live near where they work, so they have to commute to their workplace from their home, and then from their home to the workplace in the morning. And in most parts of the world, people are going to do that by car, at least in developed countries. And unfortunately, what happens is, in most times, it's just an individual person in a car. It's a very inefficient way of getting people around in an urban environment, because you have all this, several tons of steel and one person in it generating all this carbon dioxide and other pollutants. But anyway, but that's what people do. That's how people get around. At least in the United States, they do it in other countries as well. If you've ever been to Beijing, you've noticed here in Korea, it's a real problem. Uh, so basically, what happens is people build bigger and bigger, wider and wider, more and more highway space. That's basically how most cities evolve over time. Now, the thing to keep in mind, though, is as we get more and more and more highway space, if you just look at this, if you're a raindrop coming down, your odds of hitting a surface that is infiltratable, a permeable surface, is very low. So basically, there's a lot of impervious surface. So most raindrops that land in an area like this cannot infiltrate the ground. They cannot join the ground where they're going to be surface runoff. Now, the other thing that means is with more and more cars stuck here, a lot of times they're going to be sitting in traffic for long times. There's a lot of carbon dioxide, excuse me, a lot of nitrogen oxide, which then leads to a lot of hydrocarbons, which leads to a lot of ozone. So a lot of the AQI problems that we've discussed previously are generated on our roadways. Now, in order to reduce highway congestion and try to and attempt to encourage people to not just commute as one person in a car, which is very energy inefficient and highly polluting, they try to encourage people to share rides. They're ride sharing. Okay, we'll have high occupancy vehicles, HOV lanes they call them. Unfortunately, in most places, at least in the United States, that HOV lane is completely empty. Yeah, they hardly find cars in it at all. They often have this mark here. Okay, this means this is only for high occupancy vehicles, of which there just don't happen to be any. Okay, so this is a great idea. It just usually doesn't work. Okay, we need to rethink this one. It is this. All you've done is you've added more impervious surface, but you really haven't reduced traffic congestion at all. The best way to get people around is through public transportation. It's by far the most efficient way of moving people to and from work. Now, it only works if you have an end-to-end distribution system. In other words, you've got to be able to get on transit. You've got to be able to walk out the door, like me. I mean, it works perfect here in Seoul. I can walk out my apartment here in Suji, and just a few steps away from my apartment, I can get on a bus and without ever owning a vehicle, I can get almost anywhere I want to in Korea. So Korea has a very well, not just the city, but the entire country has a very well developed public transportation system, which is really great at reducing emissions and reducing the amount of impervious road space that's needed. But it only works if it's a well thought out system where you can actually get from where you start to where you want to get to it. Unfortunately, in places like Seattle, they build these rail lines that are really great at getting you from an outlying city to the downtown core, but then they're not good at getting you to your work, so nobody takes it. Now, the other thing is if roads don't have enough capacity, then it becomes really inefficient to get things in a city. And the answer is always to just expand the roadways. And that's why we end up with so much impervious road surface. All right, enough about transportation. Let's talk about when I say solid waste, I'm not talking about feces. I'm just talking about waste products that we generate in the course of our day that are not associated with sewage. Okay, so you have to have a plan for what to do. Every single person is going to generate waste in the course of a day, and you have to have a plan for what to do with it. You have a plan for how to sort it out. Some of this is reusable, so some of it is recyclable. Some of it's compostable. Some of it is just waste that we have to get rid of. So you need to have a well thought out process for how to separate things out and where to put them afterwards. Now, a lot of where it goes, and we go through our lives, we never have to think about this, but every time you throw a bag of trash away, it has to go somewhere. It doesn't just go into a black hole. It goes somewhere, okay? It goes in this big pile of trash. Now, my wife and I have done the Seoul City hike. It's like a 160-kilometer hike around the city of Seoul. And we hiked, we went to the Gayang station. We hiked over this bridge. They do archery here, which is kind of cool. Long range. I mean, these people shoot those arrows a long way. It's pretty awesome to watch. And then we hiked along this, right? And we see this mountain beside us, and then another mountain beside us. Well, those mountains that we're looking at, those were Seoul's old garbage dumps. And they've done a magnificent job of turning those into land space that can be used. This, I believe, is World Cup Stadium. And so they've actually been able to make it so it's not such a an awful thing. It's not just this nasty open mountain of trash. But anyway, is trash has to go somewhere. Unfortunately, what a lot of cities, New York City, you should just take it offshore and dump it on boats. So you have these things called garbage cans. You just dump it in the water. Um, a lot of boats still, the ships on the open ocean still do that. But a lot of municipalities around the world, they burn their trash, which is a terrible, terrible idea, because plastics and things like, they make these really exhaust products of this practice are just absolutely terrible. One of the reasons that India has some of the, well, not some of it, has, like, if you look up a list of worst air quality cities in the world, of the top 10, about 8 of them are in India, and that's because, in large part, the burning of garbage. It is just a terrible, terrible idea. All right, enough about trash. Let's talk about water. Okay, every day you're going to have to drink water. Hopefully you're washing yourself, you're washing your clothes, you're washing your dishes, you're flushing your toilets. That's a lot of water use. Okay, now that water has to come from somewhere. Okay, where can it come from? Well, it can come from an aquifer, but in most cases it comes from rivers, and these rivers usually. In order to ensure you have a steady supply, there often is a dam that's built in order to make a freshwater reservoir. Now, this water can have all kinds of um, fecal contamination from animals, pesticides, all kinds of things, right? So this water, you wouldn't want to just go there and drink it. This water has to be treated first. But I'll just say, for the city of Seoul, this is located, it's a fork of the Han River that is just to the east and a little bit north of downtown. So we make these dams for the most part, and then we take that water. And here's what we got to do: you got to turn it into something useful. So the water comes in, you filter out the big things, then you have to treat it in such a way that you are making sure that it's going to flocculate. That means you're going to take the mud particles and get them to clump together. Then you're gonna let it sort of settle out. Then you're going to put the water that comes out of here through a filtering system so that somewhat clean water comes out. You add your disinfectant to it, your chlorine to kill bacteria, your fluoride to help people's um, teeth, whatever. And then and also they also put in things just to make it taste good. Okay, they put in minerals, whatever, to make it taste good. And then you have your final product, which you then distribute to the people of your city. Now, and you know what, this works. It's weird to think, like, in a city like New Orleans, the water they're getting coming out of the Mississippi River has been through 7 people's toilets on its way to before it comes into their system. But this system, you know what? It cleans out most of the things that might, certainly all things that make you sick, and some of the things, heavy metals, things like that. We said in an earlier presentation that pesticides often do get through in small quantities, as do antibiotics and a few other things. But for the most part, the system produces what we call potable water, or safe to drink water. Now, some cities get their water from aquifers. Now, aquifers are basically magnificent water filter systems, right? So groundwater it's great, right? You can have nasty, nasty surface water that by the time it percolates through the soil and infiltrates into the ground, into the water table, by that time everything's been filtered out of it. Okay, but what happens is, as cities pump it, a couple things can happen. One is, remember, if we extract water from an aquifer at a faster rate than infiltration recharges it, well, then our aquifer is a non-renewable resource and will eventually run out of it. And if you have a city that's located, as most of the world's major cities are, near the ocean, if you're near the ocean and you're pumping fresh water out of an aquifer, you have to worry about saltwater intrusion. So remember, we talked about this before. If I start pumping the groundwater out, then the pressure here gets lower. And so what happens is water begins flowing in. So basically, water here infiltrates, salt water infiltrates, and those salt ions are, they're fully dissolved. So they'll just move with it. And what happens is, if they get to where the well is, you will never get them out sufficiently. So once that salt water has intruded to the well, you can no longer use that well. I mean, people cannot drink from it anymore. So saltwater intrusion essentially turns an aquifer from a usable reservoir into something that's of no use for drinking purposes, agricultural purposes. Essentially, it ruins an aquifer for good, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, cities that don't have an adequate water source still have to get their water from somewhere. Classic example is Los Angeles. Los Angeles is in a desert. near the ocean. There's no fresh water available to it. So what do? Well, at first it was I said it isn't any, there's a little bit. There's the Los Angeles River, it's a little tiny thing. You've probably seen movies of people driving cars through these, if you ever seen like the Terminator 2 or whatever, people they love to film movies of people driving through this concrete looking like riverbed. Well, that's the Los Angeles River actually. Okay, there's not much to it anymore because of the agriculture use upstream. But it used to be that was enough water. Well, as the city grew, they had to get water from other places. So they built these aqueducts, just like the Romans did, to carry water from far away. How far away? We're talking all the way from Sacramento. Like, this is the Bay Area. I mean, if you've ever been to California, it takes all day to drive from here to here, and a long day of driving. They carry water all the way from Sacramento down there. They wanted to come all the way up to Washington State. We said no because they wanted the Columbia River. Uh, Mono Lake, if you ever gets beautiful up that way. They pump it up over the mountains. They pump it in from the Colorado River. They also get it out of an aquifer. So they have all these sources, but the bottom line is that's a very expensive and not great way of doing things. Now, what a lot of places are starting to do now on the ocean, and we talked about this in a previous one, is desalinization. You can use a process called reverse osmosis to basically push salt water through a semi-permeable membrane and turn salt water into fresh water. It's very energy intensive, so therefore it contributes a lot to global warming by generating carbon dioxide because you have to make electricity. But it's certainly a way of providing fresh drinking water to people who live near an ocean. I mean, there is a lot of water there. You just have to get the salt out of it. You can do it through a process called reverse osmosis. Now, once people are done with water, most of it, well, all of it really is going to go down the drain, whether it goes into your body directly or just from washing or flushing toilets. Water leaves your house, it's contaminated, right? So it has to go to a sewage treatment plant. And this technology is very well designed. These are big facilities. I don't really need to go into all the details of it, but basically, the processes are very well engineered so that water comes in from sewage, and you walk around Seoul, you smell sewers. It smells terrible. It's gross and disgusting, right? But you can filter out just the water, and then you release the safe water that no longer has any kind of bacteria or anything in it back into the river or an aquifer. All right. But you had to have a plan for what to do with it. All right. And it's worth pointing out, it's like people, the flow of this has, you had to match the capacity of the city. In cities, and it's not like people are using water constantly. People mostly use their water in the morning. So when they shower and go to the bathroom before they go to work. And so, you have to have a lot of capacity to handle this. People need electricity. So outside of cities, you have to build, hopefully outside of cities, you build uh, uh, power generating facilities. Most of these, unfortunately, are going to use coal in order to make electricity. So there's going to be a lot of carbon dioxide released in the atmosphere. There's going to be a lot of AQI pollutants, sulfur dioxides, NOx. But anyway, you're going to generate that electricity and then bring it into the city. And as the city grows, you need more and more of these facilities in order to support them with electricity. All right, now you got all these impervious surfaces. You got roofs. Hopefully, you don't water through them. I had one that leaked. It wasn't good. It's bad. Being like, honey, what's that coming through the roof? All right, it was a woodpecker. We had a wooden roof, and a woodpecker pecked a hole in our roof. Anyway, um, you have roads, you have driveways, parking lots. So you have all the space where water can't get into the ground. So what does that water do? Well, that water just flows away as surface water. So in a typical city, we're talking 70 to 90% of the city may be impervious surface, incapable of infiltration. Uh, that means basically, 70 to 90% of the raindrops that come down from the sky, they're not going to the ground, so they're going to local rivers, and this can make a real problem. So, if you have enough rainwater, and this happens here in Seoul too. I mean, I've seen this here. You can get urban flooding, where the water just backs up. It just can't go down the drain anymore because there's too much water in it. Um, that said, most urban planners can plan enough capacity for their they can analyze weather patterns using previous year's data, and they can look at how much impervious surface. They can say, okay, here's how much drainage capacity we need. But in some developing countries, people don't plan well enough, and you get situations like this. All right, that's enough about all the things you have to think about in urban planning. But now there's another thing that's happening, and is a really big deal in America. I know it's not such a big deal here in Korea, but it is a big deal in America, and it is this: the concept called urban sprawl. So what happens with urban sprawl is basically people moving out of the cities where all these facilities can be planned and built to support their livings, their lifestyle. But people, they don't want to be in a city, so they move out of the city and they start building homes and shopping areas. So you see, I have a parking lot here, a shopping center here, roads, roofs, and so now I got all this. This used to be farmland, and now I got all this impervious surface, and I've got a host of other issues associated with this. So urban sprawl is a real problem in the United States and other developed countries. Now, it basically the cause behind it is people are unsatisfied with living in a city. Why do people choose to leave the city? Well, often cities have air pollution, and people want to get away from that. They want to breathe better air. Ironically, in going back and forth from the cities, they contribute much greater to air pollution. Uh, Cities tend to be noisy. I don't know if you've ever been to India, but man, people honk a lot. In New York City, oh my gosh, everybody's honking all the time. Okay, so they tend to be noisy. They tend to have more crime. I know in Korea we don't have that much, but in a lot of countries, cities, urban areas have a lot of crime. And also a lot of times urban schools, for whatever reason, tend not to be as good as suburban schools. So for these reasons, people often have this dream of moving out of the city and having a single family dwelling with a yard. Okay, and that's what leads to urban sprawl. And some of the pictures are just horrifying. Okay, so the thing is, most workplaces are still located in urban areas. So even though people live in these single family dwellings in these outlying suburban areas, they still have to get into work every day. So that means we had to build all this road. We had to have all these cars driving much greater distances. So there's a lot more carbon dioxide and other AQI pollutants associated with the people's life now. Another thing is as you move into these areas, you're displacing animals and wildlife that were living in that area before, and you're also decreasing the amount of available farm space. So there's a lot of reasons to try to discourage people from moving out of cities. So the idea is, and this is something that Korea has embraced. If you plan a city, if you have urban planning, a planned community, you think about what it is that makes somebody's quality of life good, and you ensure that it's that way. People don't leave the cities. People prefer to stay in the cities. It's more convenient. And that's certainly been a real win here in Korea. A lot of thought has gone into, hey, you want to make sure that people have green space so they can get outside. You think about the river trails. There's so many parks. There's so much outdoor space here in Korea. The mountains are all open to us because we don't have urban sprawl. There's lots of shopping immediately right where you are. There's great transportation. So if you plan a city right, people won't leave it. It's when you just let a city evolve without any kind of planning that you end up with all these problems. By the way, where I'm guilty. Okay, I live in a house that I don't commute to a city. I just live in this suburban community in America. But you know what? The sprawl is happening. It just keeps happening. People leave Seattle and they move to where I am, and they build these they tear down forest and they tear down farmland and they build these houses. And like when I first moved there, we never saw bears. We hardly ever saw deer. Now we see them all the time because they got displaced. And when people live in suburban areas, they often want to have small gardens. They want to have lawns, and so that means that they're engaging in agricultural practices. Well, we've talked about that, right? So that means they're going to use fertilizers. They're going to use pesticides, and whereas in a farm, that farmer is often accountable to some oversight from the government to make sure they're not polluting waterways. Nothing like that happens in a suburban community. So people tend to misuse. They don't know what they're doing, so they use way more fertilizer than they need to. They use way more pesticide than they need to, and it leaches into the ground. It gets in the groundwater. It runs off when it rains and gets into the local rivers. So it turns out that much like I want to say about a third of the pesticide and fertilize fertilizer pollution in American rivers is coming actually from suburban, households. Now, if you live far enough outside a city, you're too far away for them to pump potable water to you, so you had to get your water out of a well, which there's nothing wrong with that. Well water's great. It's a little bit expensive. It can taste. My brother has one. It tastes kind of like iron. It's not so great. He just uses it to flush the toilet. And he buys water, which isn't great. But like the house I live in America has what's called a septic tank. So we don't have a sewage treatment plant handling. We had to treat our own sewage. So basically, you just have it's very similar in a way, really, to what happens in a municipal one. It's just happening on a small scale in your own backyard, and as long as it works, it's great. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. However, if it doesn't work, it is a problem. So basically, it goes into this tank. There's this solids, basically, this crud falls out of it, and then the stuff comes out of it afterwards is doesn't have as much solids in it. It goes out into what's called a drain field, and that drain field lets it sink into the ground. As I said, as water seeps through the ground, that's the best purification you can get. When it works, it's great, but when it doesn't work, it's not great. And failed septic systems are all over the place. The county I come from has failed septic systems all over the place, and this leads to eutrophication of local uh, uh, what am I trying to say? Water. What am I trying to say? Like water environments. What are those words for this again? Aquatic biomes. Okay, and so basically, like the streams, the lakes, and the Puget Sound, which is a inland saltwater body, they have a lot of eutrophication, which leads to drops in dissolved oxygen. There's also a lot of human bacteria that gets into it. And you can always tell a failed septic system because all the nutrients now are coming to the surface rather than sinking into the ground. So one of the first signs that you've got a problem is when the grass starts to grow well because all the nutrients in your feces are getting into your backyard. Now, this is a picture of Korea. Now, a lot of people like myself when they first come to Korea. What's with all these apartment buildings everywhere? You know what? I've learned to think of them as being beautiful, and the reason is, yeah, they're kind of nondescript and they're everywhere. There's so many of them, but here's what happens: it's much better to build up than out. So high density urban housing is definitely the way to go. It's way better for the environment. Okay, so so again, as I said, like as long as you make it a pleasant place to live by having green space, by having good transportation, good access to uh, um, food, good access to public transportation, good schools, safe streets. If you can take care of all that, people won't leave cities. They'll like cities. They'll stay in them, and that's the challenge for a lot of urban areas. So that's it for this one. I thought I was getting confused. There's another presentation I'm doing on how to reduce urban runoff, and I thought I was heading towards that, but I'm not. So thanks for watching.